Thank you. Again, my name is Christopher Plouffe, and I'm a paleontologist at the Natural History Museum. Today we are going to take a journey into the geology and paleontology of San Diego County. We have 145 million years to do in 20 minutes, so buckle up. We are going to get a little bit of whiplash. As we begin the talk, I'm going to kind of go over the basics of geology just so we're all on the same page. So it might seem a little, elementary or remedial, but please just bear with me. I just want to make sure we are all entering this together. All right, next slide. What is paleontology? And it's the study of life that had once existed. I am only concerned with everything that's not human. I'm not an archaeologist. I'm sadly not Indiana Jones. So no tales of treasure here, but we are going to study how life was existing in the past. And we do this by evidence. Next slide, please. And that is from fossils. And fossils can be a myriad of things. A lot of people hear paleontology and they think dinosaurs, and that's great, but there are many other fossils, mammoths, mastodons, like sand dollars, clams, gastropods, even better, plants. Next slide. Leaf impressions are soft fossils, they're not hard parts, as well as trackways and burrows, so we can determine behavior from certain types of fossils. Bones just basically tell us bones. If they're broken, then that animal had an accident. But we can tell behavioral from tracks, burrows, and leaf impressions. Next slide. The rock cycle is something we probably learned back in the day, but I'm sure some of us have forgotten. Deep in the earth, it's molten rock, and that is what we're going to call igneous rocks. And then as that rock cools, we get the type of salt and pepper rock that we have in the middle. Heat and pressure can recook these rocks and make it metamorphic. So you can get a sedimentary rock or an igneous rock and then bake it and make it metamorphic. During the erosional process, you'll get sedimentary rock. So it's kind of this layering of sediments accumulating over time. Next slide. One of my favorite things to talk about is cake. And so in front of us, we see this delicious cake. It looks like red velvet. And then there's a kind of a white cream layer, and then there's a kind of a funfetti layer, and then we have another red velvet, and then looks like another cream layer. So as a geologist, I would look at this cake and say, like, hey, it's red velvet interbedded with some cream and some funfetti. If I wanted to add, let's say, an angel food cake on top of it, that would be completely different from this red velvet cycle that we are seeing down below. We call these packages of cake or layers formations. So different types of formations have different types of source rocks, or perhaps they contain different types of fossils. And this is how we determined where we're moving off in time as things accumulate. So when we are building our geologic cake, we start at the bottom, we accumulate up, and that is deposition. And then as a geologist, the way I eat my cake, I eat it from most likely the top down, or I can carve into it, like if it's a little river valley, that'll carve into sediments as well. Sometimes we have different actions in the earth due to tectonics, which we'll talk in just a bit, and that'll kind of shift things around in different formations which are deep in the earth, so the cake that's down below will be somehow forced to the top, and we can eat that delicious red velvet cake that was below that angel food cake. And then just, German chocolate cake could be on top. Who knows? Next slide. I just spoke about this tectonic motion, or these plates that are floating on the surface of the earth. I wrote this lecture for some kids, the youth programs at the museum, and so I like to talk about food. So I like to think of marshmallows floating on a cup of hot chocolate, and sometimes they run into each other, and sometimes they'll separate from each other, and then sometimes they'll sink down below the hot chocolate because they're melting. So that's kind of what's happening on Earth these days. We have these plates that are coming together or converging. We have plates that are moving away from each other, so they are diverging. And then we have plates that like to rub up against each other, so that's the strike slip. Famously, we have the San Andreas Fault here in California, so that's a big actor in the geologic stage play that's happening. We're going to watch a movie ever so quickly right now, and it's kind of a big picture, what's happening about 80 million years ago to the present. So, and I'm going to talk really quick. Oh, it started on its own. Oh, okay, so In the bottom left-hand corner, that's the Pacific Plate. To the left of North America at 80 million years ago was a plate called the Farallon Plate. At this point in time, the plate was slamming into North America and actually diving down below. And this is why we have the Rocky Mountains, because when you have plates coming together, it's like a car crash. There's going to be some crinkling and things are going to be building up. It's a mountain building event. And again, we've got the Pacific Plate, the Farallon Plate, the North American Plate. The Farallon Plate is diving underneath the North American Plate. And then when that happens, when that boundary hits North America, something happens where the plates change direction. So it goes from a converging into a strike slip, and that's how we have the San Andreas Fault. So go ahead and push play. We're gonna watch it twice, just so we can all kind of see. Subductions occurring, making mountains. And then right when that hits, notice the direction of the Pacific Plate. It kind of shifts a little bit and it's kind of grabs onto the North American Plate and starts tearing things and moving it up. We'll watch it one more time. These big picture processes really affect what's happening on the small scale, what's happening here in San Diego. So I just wanted to make sure that we had kind of this wide view. The next video that we're going to watch zooms in just a little bit more into the northern hemisphere, and we'll watch the Farallon Plate diving underneath the North American Plate. And then it grabs a hold of California. It does a really fascinating thing. It does that strike slip motion. It basically, like, imagine if you grabbed your bed sheet and you pulled it, and so it's pulling on the bed sheet of North America and stretching everything out. So we get the basin and range extension. You can see Baja Peninsula is kind of popping up. It gets torn off the North American Plate. Another thing too is watch that line on the right-hand side. It'll jump from the border of the North American Plate into Baja California. So kind of the projection of the San Andreas Fault is it might continue to move inland, of course in like a couple of million years, not too long from now. All right, back to the slideshow. Thank you very much. All right, next slide. So in San Diego, those processes that have happened have given us three provinces that I call the coastal range, the peninsular range, and then the desert. And so that's kind of the main geologic areas of San Diego. And if you were a fossil hunter and you were looking for these fossils, I would send you to the coast and I'd send you to the desert. Everything in the middle is this igneous kind of rock that came from the center of the earth. And typically when things are really hot, that's when you start cooking your fossils, and then that's not good. So we want to find our fossils in these sediments, and that will be happening on the coast and in the desert. Next slide. Anza-Borrego Desert State Park. Who here has been there? Perfect. Have you guys found fossils there? No? Okay, you're not looking hard enough. But keep your eyes to the ground. There's a ton of fossils coming out of the Anza-Borrego State Park, mostly from the Miocene. We'll be talking about the time scale, and that's kind of a scary, because we're going to talk about millions of years, and that's a lot. But the desert region is mostly the Anza-Borrego. Next slide. The peninsular range is, as the name peninsula, is from the Baja Peninsula, and you can kind of see to the right of that arrow there's a white little strand, and that's that peninsular mountain that is coming north into San Diego. So this is this igneous rock where we've got the melt at the center of the earth, and it kind of comes to the surface, but it hasn't exploded out like lava. It's basically, it's been holding there underneath the surface. It's solidified because now it's cooled down, and then it gets exposed at the surface. Next slide. This might be familiar for some of you, these kind of rounded rocks that you find in the center of San Diego County. So these are igneous rocks that have been spheroidally weathered. That's another great term I love to talk about. So that's these igneous rocks, and basically it's a homogeneous mixture, not mixture, it's homogeneous, but it's a homogeneous rock that therefore kind of weathers uniformly together, and that's why they're all kind of these similar circle shapes. Next slide, please. And then on the coast, we see the sedimentary rocks. And so this is mostly where we're finding all of our fossils here in San Diego County. I mentioned that our scale goes back to 145 million years. So at this moment in time, we don't see any rocks that are older than that. They're not exposed at the surface. So this 145 million years, these clams that we find in Rancho Penasquitos, which is basically lapping up right against those igneous rocks from the Peninsular Range. Next slide. So this is my San Diego geology cake. Down below we see the Cretaceous. We can move the Eocene, there's the Oligocene. If you can see, the Pliocene has cut into the Oligocene and Eocene, and then the Pleistocene at the San Diego Bay is right there. So this slice is a cross-section. Basically, if you were down by the border looking north and looking kind of the cross-section of the 8 freeway, you can see the 5 freeway, and Cowles Mountain is in the upper right-hand corner. So I hope that kind of makes sense. And one thing you might notice is how things are kind of bending, and that's also a fact of tectonics. So tectonics will take things and warp them and bend them and move them around. Next slide. Okay. Here's that timeline I was talking about, and it is scary. So there's a lot of time, and when I flippantly say 40 million years ago, a lot of things can happen in 40 million years. So just even a lot of things can happen in a million years. San Diego, again, paleontology starts from the Cretaceous and then we move up to the present. But if we're on the East Coast, we can get things as old as like Ordovician or Silurian sediments. So time is wild. And that's all I want you guys to know. And again, like I said, we're gonna do a little run from the Cretaceous to the present. Next slide. The Pleistocene. All right. This is the Ice Ages, basically. I've never seen the movie, so I can't like comment on these cute characters that lived during the Ice Ages, but things were fluctuating hot and cold during this time. And that was basically driving a lot of the, I don't want to say evolution of the time, but things adapt to their environment. Just know that things are living where they live because they're adapted to it. They can live there. Whales have adapted to living in the ocean. So during this time, we've got these saber-toothed cats. We can see these dire wolves. It looks like they've killed some sort of, looks like horse. That's another fascinating thing about North America. We'll talk about horses in just a minute. Next slide. The Pleistocene is 2.5 million to 10,000 years ago. And I was mentioning this climatic fluctuation that is the Ice Ages. Those things were getting hot and cold and hot and cold and hot and cold and bouncing back and forth for quite a bit of time. My background is in paleoclimatology. So my research was looking at these little tiny microscopic organisms called foraminifera, and then basically looking at how they built their homes. If you are in a warm environment, you're going to use a certain type of calcium carbonate, the carbon and the oxygen in calcium carbonate, and then if it's warmer or colder, depends on which of the isotopes are available in the ocean. So we can look at these forams and determine how warm or cold the Earth was when these guys were living, looking at their deposition over depositional time. Next slide. This is kind of be quick and dirty. The cooling you can see in North America was primarily affected during the Ice Ages. We don't have Eurasia over there because our data is not so clear what's happening, but there are large glaciers happening on North America. And when you have large glaciers, what you're doing is you're taking the water out of the ocean, you're putting it on land. And then when you melt that ice that's on land and dumping it into the water, that's when you raise sea levels. A fun little test I like to tell people is fill a glass up with ice and fill up the glass with water, so the ice cubes are sitting on top, and then let it melt. The water's not going to overflow. So if you have ice and water, that displacement's already there. You need to put that ice on land and then move it into the water for us to get this rise and fall of sea level. And that affects geography, basically. What's exposed on land, what's not exposed. We got to do this fast now. Okay, next slide. We got 5 minutes. Next slide. So we've been finding some really cool fossils from this time period. My boss thinks that sea level could have raised up to 700 feet in San Diego. So we had terrestrial and marine environments all interbedded with each other. Next slide. More mammoths. Next slide. Camels, horses, llamas, fun fact, they originated in North America, diversified, and then went worldwide. So they were no longer in North America, and then they were reintroduced by the Spaniards. Next slide. We're going to move into the Pliocene. So this was, the Pleistocene was primarily terrestrial. The Pliocene is marine. Next slide. So San Diego was a very big bay at this time. We find a lot of whales in San Diego. And Again, this is just an effect of how things are going climate-wise, but not only that, when this tectonic motion also moves things in and out of water. So sometimes things are pushed up, the land is pushed up, and sometimes that land recedes. When you're in a strike-slip environment, things can be moving at different rates and relative to each other. Next slide. Walruses are some of my favorite things that came from this time period, because typically we think walruses are very cold water, but they were here because things were actually they were pretty cool. They're not cool, but they were like temperate in climate at this point. Next slide. This is one of the skulls of a walrus that we found in Chula Vista, hence the name Valanictis chulavinensis. Next slide. This is us digging up a whale skull like in the 80s. I just like this because of scale. You can see the gentleman on the right-hand side sitting in front of a whale skull. Whales like to go to bays because they do their mating and then they have their babies and they're protected from predators like sharks. So you'll always find these whales in bays. So San Diego was a great place back during the Pliocene, to have your baby. Next slide. Manatees are also pretty rad. Mammals that were on land not one day, and they didn't decide, but they hopped back into the ocean about 40 million years ago. They're like, screw the land, we want to go back into this environment, exploit what's there, which is called a niche. So manatees used to be hanging out in San Diego. Currently you'll find them in India, in Florida, with more warmer waters. The earth was cooling at this point in time, and so they're like, oh, San Diego sucks, it's not as warm as we want it to be. Next slide. Like I said, what's better than a free lunch? If you're a shark, you're gonna go after those whales. So with whales, we find a lot of shark teeth. Next slide. Certain animals, like I said, are adapted to certain environments. And so when we look at a sand dollar, we know that we are near the shore. When we look at a scallop, we know that we are further offshore. So if we find a deposit that has primarily sand dollars in them, we know that that deposit was made close to shore. If we see a deposit that has lots of scallops, we know that we're further offshore. So we can tell where we are in the environment depending on what fossils are found there. Next slide. And then the Miocene was, and I need to change this in my talk because we just recently found a little sliver of Miocene on the coast. Right now our Miocene fossils come from Anza Borrego because that was a beautiful reef environment. Next slide. So here we are in the Miocene, 5 million to 23 million years. Now that's a pretty big chunk of time right there. And these periods are typically divided up by major geologic events that aren't happening here in San Diego. But what is in San Diego, basically we have a span between 5 and 23 million years, and that's happening in Anza Borrego. Next slide. So here we have some sedimentary layers. There's a little tiny humans at the bottom right-hand side for scale, but you can see this kind of interbeddedness happening where the most resistant layers probably are finer grained and the ones that are weathering away are probably like sands and silts. Next slide. This is a fascinating slide. You probably can't read it, but in that black box that's up top, it says Salton, and that's the Salton Sea up there. This is the Baja Peninsula on the left-hand side, and the Gulf of California once extended that far into California. Whoa, I'm gonna fall down that chair. So places like Anza Borrego, Palm Springs were all underwater at one point, and we can find these tropical reef fossils out there. Next slide. Some petrified wood can also be found in these environments. Next slide. These are something called a pen shell, and they're also found in these like warm tropical waters. The great thing about certain species is that they're environmental indicators. So we will only find these in warm water. We won't find them in cold water. So during the ice ages, we were in a warm period when we start finding pen shells in our deposits. So we know this is a warm water reef. Next slide. There's some gastropods. Next slide. And some bivalves. And again, this is what I would call monotypic bedding, which basically you just have one type of the fossil and that tells you exactly where you are. Oysters typically like to live right near shore or in bay environments. Next slide. Corals we're also find out there. Next slide. And sand dollars as well. Next slide. Oh, some more fossils. I think I went crazy here. Okay, next slide. Now we're gonna bump to the Oligocene. 40 million years ago, the Earth was, and that's the Eocene, we'll hear it in the next, was the warmest it's ever been on record, what we know. And so after that, temperature started to disintegrate, and so things were getting cooler. So this was subtropical, Eocene will be tropical. Next slide. 33 to about 23 million years ago, a lot of the formation that we find that's this age is in Chula Vista. And so we're finding these really cool early mammals out there. Also actually up north at the 78 freeway, Caltrans was doing some work and they ran into a site, and it is probably one of the best fossil producing localities in Western North America. This is a time period where mammals were figuring out kind of like what was going on. Things were really diversifying. We started getting felines because like meat eating was a new thing. Before we were just these little rodents in underground eating seeds, and so that was all like, oh, dang it, that's it. Sorry guys, bye. I'm gonna go really fast over the next few ones. So Oligocene, we'll move next. Oh, how cute is that? That's Cespia. He used to live, or she, or they used to live here in San Diego. I call these guys the sewer rats of fossils because they were everywhere. Statistically speaking, the more we find of you, the more we know that you were there in the environment. Where things like high-level predators, if you're like a saber-toothed cat or a dire wolf, we don't find too many of those because you can't really supply enough food for multiple of them. Does that make sense? Like the food pyramid, there's like one on top and then there's the rest down below. So these guys were literally everywhere. Next slide. A little bit Mesoreodon. The Oreodonts are these like pig, dog-like animals. So remember, back in time, we have modern day pigs and they're related to dogs. And so back in time on that family tree branch, that's what this Mesoreodon is. So I'm gonna talk about things being pig-like or dog-like or cat-like. So this is this pig, dog-like creature. Next slide. Oh, there's a little rodent. Rodents are pretty rad. We will look to rodents because they diversified so well that they can tell us where we are in time. This looks like a crowd where I can pull this reference really quick. And Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, there were two different Aunt Vivians. And if we had one Aunt Vivian, we knew we were in season 1 and 2. And then if there was a second Aunt Vivian, it was seasons 2, 3, and 4. So just from this one character change in this TV show, we know where we are in time. So rodents provide that same type of insight. If we have certain rodents, we know where we are in time. Next slide. All right, here's that Eocene. Things are cooking. Earth is hot at this point. San Diego's even hotter. And again, we can tell this from environmental reconstruction based on plants primarily. Banana leaves were there. Next slide. 55 to 33 million years ago. Next slide. At this point in time, I was talking just briefly earlier about how mammals were kind of figuring out kind of what was going on. We started eating meat. We had hypercarnivory in cats. Teeth are very important, and basically they reflect what we were eating. And so things started changing, like mammals started diversifying, eating everything. So we have these deposits that are showing us like the early mammal diversifications that are really fascinating. Next slide. There's a carnivore up top, you can tell from the sharp teeth because you're gonna be slicing and dicing, and then there's kind of like this herbivore down there because in the back teeth you can see the molars that are meant for grinding. So again, teeth are super important to us. Made of enamel, they are very resistant to weathering, and so sometimes we just find teeth, and the structure of that teeth will tell us what the animal is. So I'm not kidding you. I do, since I'm the micro guy, I'll sit there and I'll clean teeth all day long. So I'm a dentist, really, just a glorified dentist. Next slide. Brontotheres. I mean, these guys were like these beasts that were just running the early kind of rhinoceri. Also an herbivore from the flat molars. They would have these horns protruding, and of course we think it was for sexual selection because typically herding animals have these horns for dominance within that group. Next slide. Del Mar Formation. So now we're moving a little bit further back in time. This is about 55 million years ago. I tell people if you want to go fossil hunting, head to the Del Mar Dog Beach, and there's fossils along that row that are from the Del Mar Formation, which are about 52 million years old. So that's my little insight to you guys. If you guys want to go fossil hunting, head to the Del Mar Dog Beach, which is like near Solana Beach, if I remember correctly, and just take a walk north from the Dog Beach, and you guys can find fossils exposed on the cliffs there that are 52 million years old. Next slide. Scripps Formation, all right, so now we've got some clams. I will be brutally honest, a lot of San Diego, since we're so close to the water, we have a lot of marine fossils. Scripps Formation doesn't make my socks roll up and down, so we're not gonna spend too much time. We're already late. Next slide. Plants, again, very important when it comes to paleo-environmental reconstructions. They tell us how warm or cold things are. Plants can't move, they're stuck. You and I, we can move. We can go to Cabo San Lucas if it's too cold, you know what I'm saying? Or if it's too hot, we're gonna go up to Alaska. Whales have migratory routes that are ginormous. Plants tell us exactly what's happening at the time. Next slide. Whenever you have a palm, it's hot. Next slide. Banana leaves, like I said, things were cooking in the Eocene. Next slide. Ooh, the Cretaceous, here we go. We're almost there, I promise. Cretaceous is the age of the dinosaurs. And everyone, you know, everyone loves dinosaurs. I'm not that everyone. Yeah, so San Diego was underwater at this point in time. We don't have dinosaurs. I'm not saying we don't have it. We have them, they're just very sparse. That dinosaur had to basically be on land, die, then wash out to sea, and then sink to the bottom of the ocean, and that's when we get it. And at that point, we don't get whole specimens. Things start disarticulate, you know, second law of thermodynamics. Things fall apart, chaos in the universe. So we don't find complete specimens of dinosaurs in San Diego. So we were underwater, mosasaurs, ammonites, those kind of critters were roaming the streets. Next slide. And this is 145.5 to 65 million years. Like I said, that clam that we have from Rancho Penasquitos is our oldest fossils here in San Diego right now. So there's a young paleontologist out there. I saw him. He'll find hopefully the oldest one. Next slide. These guys are pretty rad. Again, you adapt to environment. When San Diego being underwater at that point, we were really far offshore in very fine-grained sediments. Think of it like quicksand. So these guys had this kind of cantilever where they basically rested on that so they could move in these very fine-grained muds at the bottom of the ocean. Next slide. Ammonites are awesome. You know, they were floating around up on the upper right-hand side, kind of what the reconstruction of this was. When I say that we have so many ammonites, it hurts. And they're just big and heavy, but we keep them. So we have a lot of ammonites. It's quite amazing. Next slide. The ankylosaur or nodosaur, we don't know. And you want to know why? Because all we have is the butt of this. Yeah, literally. Skulls are very important. Teeth are important. They help us identify what is what, who is who. But when you just have postcranial, everything kind of is the same. Think of a horse and a llama and a camel. I mean, they all kind of structurally look the same. And if you just think of their bones, a lot of their bones are the same too. What's happening in the head really tells us what's going on. Teeth really helps us what's going on. Next slide. So there's the butt. Very exciting. We got the hips, we got the legs. That's all we got. So at some point it washed out to sea. Maybe somebody took a bite out of it and then half of it sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Because these animals have these plates that are interlocking, we have this thing called bloat and float. So their stomach will start to bloat and then they just sail away out to the ocean. And then they sunk at San Diego. Next slide. And I think that kind of concludes our talk. This picture is misleading. It's in our museum. We have all these beautiful murals, but this is probably taken somewhere in Arizona, maybe even New Mexico. Again, San Diego is offshore, far offshore, very fine-grained sediment. So this is a little bit misleading, but here are those dinosaurs I'm sure all of you wanted to see. Next slide. And that's it, yeah.